In 1963, you're sipping Scotch whiskey in a luxurious apartment on Patriarch's Ponds in Moscow, reading a 3-day-old London newspaper. Fresher copies aren't delivered. A matter of secrecy, you understand. You are now a state secret of the USSR, a living classified asset, who only reads about himself in old newspapers. Outside, it's January, 20 below zero. The wind howls, and some Soviet citizen downstairs has been trying to start his jalopy in the frost for an hour, unsuccessfully. Meanwhile, in London, at MI6 headquarters, there's panic, investigations, dismissals, nervous breakdowns, and heart attacks. The weather in London is currently 8 degrees Celsius, foggy, Piccadilly, the smell of wet wool and exhaust fumes. You know it all by heart. You grew up with it. That smell is in your bones like a family curse. And you betrayed every person who breathed that smell beside you. For 30 years. Methodically. With cold professional pleasure. Working for Soviet. Intelligence. You handed over dozens of agents, real people with names and families, directly to Soviet counterintelligence. You nullified operations that the British and Americans had prepared for years. You shut down intelligence channels that cost vast sums of money and human lives. At MI6, your name is uttered with an expression as if something had gone rotten in their mouths. In Moscow, you were given an order, a KGB general's rank, and this apartment. In London, the gallows awaited you. If they had managed to catch you, they didn't. How did it happen? We'll tell you now. Because this is a story about how one man with the right accent, a Cambridge degree, and a glass of whiskey in hand cleverly deceived one of the world's most powerful counterintelligence agencies for 30 years. Every single day, without a single slip-up. And he never regretted it. Almost. Now let's rewind 30 years and understand why all of Great Britain hates you. Cambridge, 1933. You're 21, the son of St. John Philby, a renowned Arabist, advisor to kings, a man with so many opinions on every topic that being near him for more than half an hour is physically exhausting. You grew up in the shadow of this loud, proper English grandeur and understood one thing from childhood. The system that produced such people was rotten to the core. Outside the college window, the Great Depression was devouring Europe alive. Factories stood idle. Queues for soup snaked through London streets. Hitler was already in Berlin. Fascism crept across the continent like mold on a damp wall. Yet the British establishment sat in its clubs, drinking port and pretending nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Because for them, everything was always fine. Such was the nature of these people, to notice nothing until their own club caught fire. It was then that Arnold Deutsch entered your life. And here, remember this, because this man is the key to the entire story. Deutsch was an Austrian in his 30s, short, stout, with a round, benevolent face that was utterly forgettable. And that's exactly how it was meant to be. The face of someone you saw yesterday but couldn't describe today. Officially, he was a psychology student at London University. Unofficially, he was an illegal resident of Soviet intelligence in Britain, operating without diplomatic cover, without embassy protection, relying purely on skill and cool nerves. Later, historians would call him the most effective recruiter in the history of Soviet intelligence. In 33, he was just a pleasant Austrian who knew how to listen and ask the right questions. He found you through mutual acquaintances in left-wing circles. In 1930s Cambridge, they were everywhere, like mushrooms after rain. Only instead of a forest, there were university lawns. The first meeting was in a small pub on King's Parade. The beer warm as always in England, few people. Someone in the corner was playing something mournful on the piano. Deutsch sat opposite you, watching with such attention as if you were saying something important, though you were just talking politics about Hitler, about Britain being blind and foolish, typical student chatter about the world order. But he listened. He truly listened, not waiting for you to finish so he could speak, but actually listening. And it was so unusual that you spoke more than you intended. An hour later, he said calmly, almost dully, "Kim, you are an intelligent man with the right views. But views without action are just words. Do you want to change things or just talk about it?" You finished your beer, looked at him, asked, "What exactly are you proposing?" Deutsch smiled, not broadly, barely noticeably. "For a start, another meeting." For the next 3 meetings, he offered nothing concrete, just talked, listened, sometimes asked questions that seemed random but were precise as a scalpel. He was studying you, your motives, your weaknesses, your readiness. He was a psychologist by training and a spy by vocation, a rare and dangerous combination. At the 4th meeting, he said directly, "We want to recruit you, not for money, for an idea. You will work for the Soviet Union from within the British system. It is dangerous. It will be long. It will require you to become a different person publicly while remaining yourself inside. Are you ready?" You were silent for about 10 seconds. Then you said, "Yes." That was the entire moment that changed everything. No drama, no threats, no pressure. Just 2 men in a pub and 1 decision. The price of this decision: dozens of human lives, several major failures for Western intelligence, and 30 years of lies. But then, you were 21, and you were sure it was all correct. Deutsch gave you your first assignment immediately, and it was unexpected. No documents, no surveillance. He said, "Join the Anglo-German Friendship Society, become right-wing, publicly, write about it, talk about it, meet the right people." You looked at him uncomprehendingly. He explained patiently, as one explains the obvious. "Kim, a left-wing Cambridge student will never get into British intelligence. A right-wing journalist with the right connections? Very much so." The logic was brutal and absolutely correct. You spent the next year pretending to be a fascist sympathizer, attending meetings, meeting the right people, writing articles with the correct slant. It was disgusting and professionally necessary. The first lesson of espionage: you are not who you seem. Never. In parallel, Deutsch worked with others. 4 of your Cambridge acquaintances, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, went through the same pub meetings, the same conversations, the same yes at the end. Thus, the Cambridge Five was born. 5 young Britons from the best families, with the best degrees, with brilliant careers ahead of them, all recruited by one unremarkable Austrian who later died in '42 when a German torpedo sank the ship he was on. Deutsch never learned how successful his students became. A pity. He would have appreciated it. 1939. You're in MI6. You got in exactly as Deutsch advised. Through the right connections, the right reputation, the right accent, and the right tie. British intelligence at the time was such a closed system of insiders that vetting basically came down to, from the right university, right family, speak properly. Welcome. We're all like that here. It never occurred to anyone that this cozy insularity, this blind trust in their own, was the main security hole through which you would walk for 30 years. You were accepted. You sat at a desk in the building on Broadway Street and began to work. Or rather, began to work for 2 masters simultaneously. The first documents you passed to Moscow were MI6 operational summaries on Spain. The Civil War was ongoing. The British had an agent network there. You knew names and safe houses. Moscow received the list. What happened to those people afterwards? You didn't track. That was someone else's problem. Your problem was to pass the information cleanly and not get exposed. You excelled at that. 1941, you were appointed head of MI6's Iberian section. Spain, Portugal, operations against the Germans on the peninsula. This was no longer a trickle of information. It was a river. You knew the entire agent network in the region, all operations, all sources. Every week you met with your handler, no longer Deutsch, but another person from the Soviet embassy, meetings at different locations in London, a new place each time, and handed over materials. Agents' names, couriers' routes, operation plans, codes. Moscow received a complete picture of British intelligence activities on the Iberian Peninsula in near real time. The Germans didn't know about this. The information went only to the Soviets. This was a matter of principle. You were working against one side, not helping another. That was the logic. Beautiful logic. Convenient. But Iberia was just a warm-up. The real work began when Germany attacked the USSR and everything turned upside down. Yesterday's allies became truly allied. Information flowed in a different direction, and you found yourself in the unique position of seeing both sides simultaneously. 1943. The Germans were preparing Operation Citadel, the largest tank offensive at the Battle of Kursk. Germany poured everything it had into it. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide of the war in the East. British intelligence received a detailed plan through its agent network. Start date, directions of attack, composition of forces, everything. The documents passed through you. You read them, made a copy, handed it to your handler at another meeting in London, this time in a small Italian restaurant in Soho. The handler ordered pasta and looked like a perfectly ordinary person on their lunch break. Moscow received the plan of the German offensive weeks before it began. Soviet command managed to prepare a deeply echeloned defense, concentrate reserves, and build anti-tank lines precisely where the Germans were expected to strike. The Battle of Kursk became the largest defeat of German armored forces in the entire war. The Germans couldn't understand the leak until the end. They searched their headquarters, shot several people on suspicion, but never found it. They were looking in the wrong place. The information left London from an Italian restaurant in Soho, from a man who drank whiskey and read documents marked British Secret. You didn't think of it as a military victory. You thought of it as a job well done. A small but important difference. Something else was happening in parallel. And this was more important than Kursk, more important than Iberia, more important than anything you did before or after. The atomic project. The Americans and British were working on nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project, thousands of scientists, billions of dollars. A level of secrecy so high that most people working at the sites didn't even know what their neighbors in the next building were working on. Soviet intelligence was desperately trying to understand what was happening. Moscow understood the strategic significance but lacked the full picture. Through you came not technical documentation. You weren't a physicist. Bomb blueprints weren't your specialty. Through you came something else, and in a sense, more valuable. The project structure, the names of key participants, funding channels, security levels, coordination between the British and American parts of the program. You provided Moscow with a complete organizational map of the Manhattan Project. Who was responsible for what? Where to look for technical leaks? Which scientists could be approached through ideological or financial leverage? Soviet intelligence used this map as a navigator, finding the right people, approaching them, and then obtaining technical documentation from them. Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, others. They provided the blueprints. You provided the map by which they were found. The USSR tested its atomic bomb in 1949, 4 years earlier than the Americans expected. The Americans were in shock. How? From where? By what means? They looked for leaks. They found Fuchs. They found others. They didn't find you. By that time, you were in another position, drinking whiskey with colleagues who discussed the Soviet atomic bomb with the air of people who had just been unpleasantly surprised. You made a surprised face, too. You were good at it. Practice. 1944. And this is where something begins that still makes people at MI6 physically ill when they think about it. You were appointed head of MI6's anti-Soviet department. Think about that phrase. A Soviet agent placed in charge of operations against Soviet intelligence. This wasn't just a fox in the henhouse. It was a fox compiling a list of all the chickens, describing their security methods, and sending that list to the fox's superiors every week. In your new position, everything passed through you. Operations to infiltrate agents into Soviet structures, plans to recruit Soviet citizens abroad, lists. of known MI6 Soviet intelligence officers targeted for development. You read these documents, made notes, wrote resolutions, and simultaneously prepared copies for Moscow. Every agent the British tried to infiltrate into Soviet structures failed. Every recruitment operation was blown. Every Soviet officer targeted for development received a warning. MI6 thought Soviet counterintelligence was simply very effective. In reality, Soviet counterintelligence was simply reading your weekly reports. But there was one moment, one specific failure that cost especially many lives, and which you recall least often. 1949, an operation to infiltrate anti-communist agents into Albania. The British, in conjunction with the Americans, prepared several groups, local immigrants, trained, armed, with specific assignments to destabilize Hoxha's regime. The operation was developed for months, cost enormous sums of money, and people underwent serious training. The operation plans passed through you. You were the liaison officer with the Americans. Everything was coordinated at your level. Moscow received complete documentation, agents' names, infiltration dates, landing points, safe houses within the country. When the groups landed in Albania, they were waiting for them. All of them. Some were shot on the spot, some were captured alive and used for disinformation. Not a single person completed their mission. The British and Americans couldn't understand why for a long time. The operation was so secret that the list of those privy to it was minimal. They sifted through leak theories for years. They were looking in the wrong place. And this is where, precisely here, in 1945, the first of two events occurs that nearly sent you to the gallows. And you didn't know about it. Not at all. You were sitting in your office, drinking tea, reading dispatches, and had no idea that at that very moment, in the Soviet consulate in Istanbul, a nervous man in civilian clothes was urgently asking to be connected with a British diplomat. The man's name was Konstantin Volkov. He was an NKVD officer, deputy resident in Turkey, and he wanted to defect to the West. The British diplomat received him, took notes. Because Volkov said something very specific. I know the names of 7 Soviet agents within British structures, 2 in the Foreign Office, 1 the head of a counterintelligence unit in MI6. Itself. The diplomat wrote everything down word for word, encrypted it, sent it to London. In London, the dispatch arrived at MI6. Who should handle matters related to Soviet defectors? Of course, the head of the anti-Soviet department. That is, you. The folder landed on your desk on a Friday morning. You opened it, read it, and something inside you very coldly and very clearly said, "This is about you." Volkov described the agent in enough detail that someone familiar with MI6's internal structure could narrow the list down to a few names. Head of counterintelligence, long-serving, good access. The pause between this thought and your next action was about 3 seconds. No more. Then you closed the folder, placed it in the stack of incoming documents, stood up, left the building ostensibly for lunch, walked to a phone booth on the next street, and dialed a number you knew by heart and never wrote down. You said one word, Istanbul, hung up, returned to the office. 8A. Sandwich at your desk. Wrote a resolution on a couple of other documents. A normal workday. 3 weeks later, when the British delegation finally reached Istanbul to retrieve Volkov, he had vanished, along with his wife. Soviet colleagues had gotten there first, flying both of them to Moscow on a special plane, disguised as critically ill diplomatic staff, wrapped in bandages. What happened to them afterwards is officially unknown. Unofficially, everyone understood. You wrote a report stating the source could not be found due to technical reasons, communication delays, bureaucracy. You received a nod from your superiors, went to drink whiskey with colleagues. That's how you saved yourself the first time, at the cost of 2 lives, at minimum. The idea is more important than people. You believed that. In 1945, another case passed through you, and this one was very close to personal. Elizabeth Bentley, an American agent for Soviet intelligence, a courier who for years carried materials from Soviet sources in American government structures, came to the FBI and began to give detailed testimony. She knew names. Dozens of Soviet agents and sympathizers in the American government, in the Treasury Department, in the State Department. The FBI began to investigate each name. The Americans shared information with their British colleagues, standard Allied exchange procedure. The materials on the Bentley case passed through you. You read the list of names she provided. Among them were people connected to Soviet networks in Britain, indirectly, through several handshakes, but connected. The list went to Moscow. The center was able to understand exactly what the FBI knew, who was at risk, who needed to be urgently deactivated or evacuated. Several Soviet agents in America who appeared in Bentley's testimony quietly ceased activity precisely when the FBI began to look into them. Coincidence? Bentley later told investigators that she was sure there was a mole in British intelligence who saw everything she was revealing. She was right. She just couldn't prove it. Proof. That was always your main defense. There was never enough of it. Almost never. 1950. And now it's truly terrifying, because the threat didn't come from Istanbul, but from American decryption centers. Operation Venona. For several years, the Americans had been deciphering intercepted Soviet diplomatic telegrams from the war years. Slowly, partially, with enormous effort. But they did get something readable. An agent with the code name Stanley appeared in the telegrams. Description? British, high access, working since the early 40s, an exceptionally valuable source. The Americans passed the information to the British started digging. And the more they dug, the more Stanley resembled someone from MI6's Washington residency. You, at this time, had just been transferred to Washington, a liaison officer between MI6 and the CIA, the highest level of access to joint operations, a gold mine for Moscow, a golden target for the investigation. In parallel, 2 of your Cambridge comrades were exposed. Burgess, loud, a heavy drinker, scandalous, a man who managed to attract attention even when silent, was living at your house in Washington, officially as an embassy employee, unofficially as a living headache you couldn't get rid of. McLean in London was falling apart. The Americans were pressuring him. British counterintelligence began an internal investigation, narrowing the circle. Moscow made a decision. Evacuate both immediately. In May 1951, Burgess received the signal. Run. And he ran. With McLean. Both disappeared on the same day. Both later reappeared in Moscow. Britain exploded. Parliament. Newspapers. A scandal of national proportions. How 2 high-ranking diplomats just left and went to the Soviets. And that's when your problem became fully apparent. Because Burgess lived at your house. Everyone knew that. Burgess turned out to be a Soviet agent. Everyone knew that now too. The question circulating in the corridors of MI6 and the CIA was one. What about Philby? You were called in for questioning. The interrogator, named Hellawell, dry, meticulous, with the eyes of a man who trusts absolutely no one and considers it a professional virtue, sat opposite you and watched. He watched for a long time. Then he asked, "Did you know about Burgess's political views?" You answered calmly. Precisely that calmly. Not too much, just enough. Like someone slightly offended by being asked this at all. Guy was an eccentric man. Many in our circle had left-wing views in their youth. That didn't make them Soviet agents, otherwise we'd have to fire half of Cambridge. Hellawell. Wrote it down. Looked. And you yourself, Philby, did you have left-wing views in your youth? You smiled slightly wearily. Just slightly. Measuredly. Hellawell. I had many views in my youth. I've worked for British intelligence for 20 years. If you have evidence, present it. If not, let's not waste each other's time. Hellawell wrote it down, closed the folder. He presented nothing, because there was no direct evidence. There were suspicions, very strong ones, but not evidence. A fundamental difference in the British legal system, and this difference saved you a second time. MI6 still asked you to leave, quietly, without scandal, no pension. You returned to London, rented an apartment, sat and waited. Inside you, something interesting was happening at this time. Not panic, not hysteria, but a continuous cold tension. Like when you hold something very heavy for a long time and can't put it down, and don't know how much longer you have to hold it. You went over the options every evening, what they knew for sure, what they suspected, where there might be a flaw you weren't seeing. Whiskey helped less than usual. You slept poorly. For the first time in 20 years of work, you felt the ground beneath your feet wasn't solid. In 1955, Member of Parliament Marcus Lipton stood at the Tribune and named you the third man, the one who helped Burgess and McLean escape. The newspapers exploded. Philby's name on the front pages. The phone went silent. Old acquaintances stopped calling. Lunch invitations ceased. People who shook your hand yesterday now looked right through you on the street. British social execution. Quiet, without a shout. You just stopped being noticed. Effective and disgusting at the same time. And then something happened that defied all logic except British logic. Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan stood in Parliament and publicly declared, "Philby is not a Soviet agent. The government has no evidence of his guilt." Lipton, under pressure, retracted his words. Apologized. To you. Publicly. You accepted the apology with the dignity of an offended man who had been unjustly accused. And this was the most twisted scene in your entire biography. An innocent man apologized to the guilty for. Accidentally speaking the truth. The system you betrayed for 30 years protected you from exposure because trust in one of us proved stronger than evidence against one of their own. This is what you had counted on from the very beginning. This is why Deutsch chose you in 33. Not just an intelligent man with left-wing views, but a man who would forever look like one of their own to those he betrayed. MI6 quietly took you back, unofficially with journalistic cover, sending you to Beirut as a correspondent. You wrote articles about the Middle East, met with your handler from the Soviet residency in a small restaurant in the old city where they made good hummus and where none of the right people went. You passed whatever you could. You lived. You drank. You thought about Volkov sometimes. Fleetingly, not for long. No need to linger. 1962. And now, everything. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer, defected to the West and gave detailed testimony. He knew enough about the Cambridge Five for British counterintelligence to converge on one name. Yours. In January 1963, Nicholas Elliott flew to Beirut. An old friend, an MI6 colleague, a man with whom you had drunk whiskey for 20 years, gone to lunches, shared work stories, and to whom you had lied to his face for just as many years every time he looked you in the eyes. He came to your home, sat down, looked at you for a long time, and said without preamble, softly, almost wearily, "Kim, we know. Golitsyn has testified. We have enough. Let's talk like old friends." You looked at him. Nicholas Elliott, the right face, the right tie, the right weary look of a man who finds what he's doing very unpleasant. He was clearly suffering. 20 years of friendship, and he sits opposite you with a folder and such an expression. You almost felt sympathy. Almost. "Nicholas," you said slowly, with that British composure you'd honed for 30 years, "I don't understand what you're talking about." Elliot sighed, took out a folder, placed it on the table between you. "Kim, stop it. Golitsyn described you in enough detail. If you cooperate, there's a chance to negotiate a minimal sentence, quietly, without a public trial. If not," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. You both knew what came after that, if not. You looked at the folder and thought, quickly, very quickly, as you think when 30 years of experience are on the line and every second counts. What they knew for sure. Where were just guesses? Was there anything in that folder that would kill you in court? Or only something that would kill you in the newspapers? And most importantly, what would happen if you stayed? A trial, a public process, all of Britain watching. And in the end, not the gallows. They didn't hang people in 63 anymore. But life imprisonment wasn't an apartment on Patriarch's Ponds with a view of the ponds either. You gave Elliot partial confessions. Enough for him to think you were cooperating, not enough to become legal material. You asked for time to think. He agreed. An old friend, 20 years of habit. He trusted instinctively. He left. You picked up the phone. 3 days later, you vanished from Beirut. The Soviet cargo ship Dolmatova left port with one unplanned passenger on board. British counterintelligence realized it a day later. They sent inquiries, airports, borders, ports. Too late. You stood on deck in the open sea, drinking Soviet champagne that turned out to be awful, looking at the dark water and thinking, 30 years. The end of one part. The beginning of another. Wonder what the whiskey in Moscow would be like. It turned out, none. You had to arrange for deliveries. Moscow, February 1963. Gray, cold, with so much snow it seemed the city had been buried in it specifically to hide what lay beneath. The apartment on Patriarch's Ponds, your handler Mikhail Borisovich, a meticulous colonel with the face of a man who had seen everything and long ceased to be surprised, said at your first meeting, "Welcome, Kim. You are safe." You nodded and thought, safe from what exactly? From the gallows? Yes. From loneliness in a city where you didn't understand the language? No. From the feeling that your entire life remained on the other side of the sea? No. Not that either. But these were details. The main thing, alive. The main thing, not in prison. The main thing, Scottish whiskey could be obtained, albeit with logistical difficulties. The KGB used you as a consultant, giving lectures to young officers on the psychology of Western intelligence officers, on MI6 and CIA methods, on how the enemy thinks from within, because you had been that enemy for 30 years and knew him better than he knew himself. A strange job, explaining to people in Soviet uniform how the system you had been dismantling for 30 years was structured. Sometimes during these lectures, you thought about Elliot, how he sat opposite with the folder and such a weary face, what he thought when he learned you had escaped. Probably very bad thoughts. Your guilt for that was zero. Almost. In 1988, you died in that apartment, a heart attack, in bed, 76 years old. The KGB sent a wreath. In London, the obituary was short and cold. They didn't hang him. They didn't imprison him. He died in his own bed with whiskey on the nightstand and a 3-day-old London newspaper on the table. Unfair. Depends on whose side you're looking from. The idea is more important than people. You believed this for 30 years, or convinced yourself that you believed it. The difference between those two things? That dark crevice you'd rather not stare into for too long? Especially at night. Especially when the whiskey runs out and the next crate won't arrive for 3 days.